when you look at the offense, that's the first thing that I want to see. And as we sort of dive into this matchup, Ryan, and we look at like the run offense and the pass offense and the total offense, Notre Dame's going to have an advantage in every matchup here. It's about, can you come out and execute at a high level? That's going to be a key. But this one right here is kind of where it starts. And like, as we said, Notre Dame's got some very strange statistics. And you're still at the point of the year, Ryan, where you ask yourself, okay, who is Notre Dame really? Mm-hmm. And I think this is one where you absolutely look at it and say, okay, we're going to learn a lot about it now, because when you look at Notre Dame and you look at their success on the ground the first 3 games, Notre Dame in the first 3 games of the season averaged 117.7 rushing yards per game. In 2 games, they've been able to go from – they were averaging 117.7 going into the North Carolina game. They've been able to jump that over 57 yards in 2 games. That is a big jump in 2 games, even this early in the season. In the last 2 games, Notre Dame has averaged against 2 teams that either were ranked, BYU, or are now ranked, North Carolina. They averaged 260.5 yards per game. Mm-hmm. And so this is a Stanford defense, as the numbers show, is not very good at stopping the run. And so this is a matchup, Ryan, where on paper it doesn't look like a huge mismatch. But if Notre Dame is the team they were the first 3 games, it's slight advantage Notre Dame. If Notre Dame is the team they've been the last 2 weeks, it's going to be huge advantage Notre Dame. And that's goes to your point, Ryan. Don't take a step back. Yeah. This is a great for the rushing offense. This is a great building block opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and Brian, it's always, I mean, there's recency bias, right? But I mean, we can only judge this team based upon what they were the last time that we saw them on a football field, right? In the last 2 weeks, they've been a very good running team. I mean, and I was just about to say, even before you kind of highlighted it, like that yard per game rushing average on average performance is getting a lot more respectable than it was a couple weeks ago when we did this show, right? Like it's starting to look pretty good. It's getting there, man. It's climbing, right? So assuming that Notre Dame continues to have the exponential growth that we keep talking about, they continue to take it to that next step, then this is a massive advantage, right? Like it isn't an even advantage for me, because Stanford has pretty much been this team all the way from a run defense perspective, right? Like it's not like we've seen them start out terrible, get better, start out great, get worse. Like this is a team that has been just not a good run stopping team even last season. Like this is just what they've now become. So Notre Dame talked about starting fast, and I agree completely, because the other thing about Stanford is that Stanford has stayed in some football games this year for a while, and then like down the stretch of games, it's just like they fade, like then it's over at that point. So if Notre Dame gets a good start, first and foremost, you got to feel like you feel really good about the potential of the game, because Notre Dame has shown a proclivity to kind of, stay down the stretch a little bit. And I think that it starts right here, man. Right here.
What was one of the knocks on Brian Kelly for a time, and not just Brian Kelly, you go back to Charlie. I mean, there's been a lot of, this isn't a pick on Brian Kelly day, but Notre Dame for a long time, it's that thought of they would play down to teams, right? And that's the thing, late last year, we didn't see that as much, which is good. But, this is an opportunity. We're like, look, this is an inferior opponent, and we're talking strictly from the offense standpoint. This is an inferior opponent. It's your chance to go out there and have success. And I think when you talk about context, we're big into context, right? And I think that's a very important thing for understanding an opponent. And when you look at Stanford, Ryan, they gave up 159 yards to Colgate on the ground, 164 to USC, 169 to Washington, 351 to Oregon, and 192 to Oregon State. There's only been one really bad game among that. When you look at the teams they play, there's not a lot of good rushing teams on their schedule so far this year. They gave up 159 to Colgate. So far on the season, Colgate is only averaging 136.6, which means it got worse.
On the FCS level, too.
Correct, which means it got worse for them running the football after Stanford. And so they scored as many points against Stanford as they did against Holy Cross. I'm just going to point that out real quick. And Holy Cross went out there and rushed for 104 yards. Colgate rushed for 102 yards against Holy Cross. So, I mean, it just kind of, again, context. They held USC to 164 yards. USC's averaging 183 on the season. So that was a game where they held USC below their season average, which is a good performance. But part of that was they gave up 341 passing yards and 74.1 completion percentage, 12.6 yards per attempt and 4 touchdowns through the air.
Yep.
So it was one of those things where USC wasn't necessarily, looking to run the ball a whole lot, and averaged 4.7 yards per carry, which isn't great, but that's kind of on par, a little bit below where they've done. So that was a decent job there. Okay,
yep.
Washington, they held Washington to 169 yards, 5.3 yards per attempt, but Washington on the season is only averaging 142.2 and 4.3 per carry. So Washington had a full yard per carry higher and 27 yards more in that matchup. They gave up 351 to Oregon, who's the only team that they face that averages at least 190 rushing yards per game as of right now. Oregon averages 241.7 and 6.2 per carry. They went for 351 and 9.5 per carry against Stanford.
They're almost getting a first down every time they run the football. Like
right. And we just showed how Notre Dame statistically against BYU was very similar to where Oregon was, right? And so Oregon rushed for 212 yards and 4.8 yards per carry against BYU. Notre Dame went for 234 yards and 5.2 yards per carry against BYU. Mm-hmm. So both teams had success against the one common opponent. This kind of, again, context, right? Yep. And so I think that's a one where you look at and say, hey, that's an area where Notre Dame or Stanford really struggled, and Oregon had over 100 yards above their average, which when you're averaging 241 yards per game is impressive to go 100 over. And then they gave up 192 yards and 4.8 per carry to Oregon State, which is almost right where Oregon State is on the year. Oregon State's at 181 on the season and 4.85 per carry. So Oregon State pretty much met their mark, but Oregon State hadn't really been running the football all that well coming into that game. They were at 171 against Utah and 153 against USC, and really they've been solid but not great all season. So when you look at the context of it, Ryan, Stanford has allowed most teams they've played, all but USC, to go above their season rushing average. And they're teams that don't run the football very well, which makes this number right here look even worse when you consider that. They have only played really one good rushing team this season. And, that, like I said, Oregon's the only top 25 rushing offense they face. So on paper, even with Notre Dame's overall season numbers, Ryan, this is a big advantage for Notre Dame. And they need to carry it out, because what has been the offensive line's reason for success? I wouldn't necessarily say that they look like the 2017 unit. They're just blowing people off the ball. They're getting better movement, but it's been about there's more cohesion. They're playing as a unit better. They're getting to the second level. You made a comment to me when you were talking about Stanford's offensive line. You're like, dude, I don't know if I've seen them get to the second level yet when I'm breaking down their film. Well, that was Notre Dame in the first 2 games. Yeah. But we've seen them get, like late second quarter against Cal, we started to see more of that. We saw that against Carolina. We saw that against BYU, especially in the second half. So they're playing together more. Now the next step, Ryan, is be more dominant. I think that's the next step. And this is a team that I think you should be able to establish that, Ryan.
Well, I think that's where the big advantage is, right? Like offensive line to the defensive line and front seven, just in general for Stanford. I think that Notre Dame has a big advantage on paper, and especially what it's been the last 2.5 games, right? Because when you think about, folks, it wasn't too long ago that we were talking after the first couple games about how poor the offensive line looked, right? Like it was bad. But the last 2.5 football games starting to look good. Like you said, there's cohesion that's starting to build, right? Jared Patterson's really settling into the left guard position. Zeke Correll's playing good football.
That's the guy that's made the biggest jump from the first 2 games to now.
Agreed.
He was to the point where it's like they're going to have to consider maybe making a change.
Making a move, yeah. Like we were ready to call for Patterson to move back to center, right? Like we were ready for it.
Like let's give him another game, but he got better against Cal. Yep. He really took a jump against Carolina, but it's like, look, their defense stinks. Let's see, because the one thing about BYU is they didn't have a great rush defense, but up the middle, they were pretty good.
Yeah.
And they had some big boys, and I thought Zeke more than held his own in that game. And so That's, to me, been the big key because, Ryan, you cannot run the football effectively on a consistent basis if you're getting beat up the middle. If your center's getting whipped, you can't do it. And it's not a surprise. It's not a shock or a coincidence at all that as Zeke has played better, the run game has gotten better. It's not
100%.
a coincidence. It's not a coincidence.
Especially with how Notre Dame runs their scheme, right? Like they'll run a little bit of outside zone and some jet and stuff. But I mean, for the most part, they're running inside zone, duo, power. Like they're running inside oriented runs. So, I mean, Zeke Correll, we need to give him credit. Like we gave Drew Pine a lot of credit yesterday on the show, right? We need to give Zeke Correll a lot of credit because it could have been easy for him to just duck his head, go into his shell and just be like, poor me. Like I'm just not, it's not going to happen for me. Right. But he has fought back through adversity as the whole offensive line has. And we have seen growth from him. We've seen comfort from Jared Patterson. We've seen solid play the last 2 weeks from Josh Lugg. Nothing spectacular, but good enough. And we've started to see an evolution. I mean, Joe Alt throughout the majority of the season has played at an All-American level, for being honest, right? Like he's played very good football. And Blake Fisher has taken a big step over the last two games, excuse me. So now this is the opportunity for them to say, hey, we have now we're starting to stack football games every week now, right? Offensive line is playing a whole lot better. Now let's do it again and show that it's not a fluky thing. It's not a couple game then regression thing. And let's show that we can, at the end of the season, be one of the best, or middle of the season, be one of the best offensive lines in college football. I still don't think that's unreasonable to think at the end of the season. We can look back and say when they got to their peak, when they made that ascension, they could argue for one of the best offensive lines in college football. They have that type of talent. They always have. They now are getting more confident, and you can see that confidence is now exuding out onto the football field. They are playing at a much higher level from an energy perspective and from a technical perspective and just from a comfort perspective right now.
I mean, I think they're already, if you just look at the last 2 weeks, they are looking like a top 10 unit. Their pass pro's been great. Their run game has been very good. As we mentioned, the last 2 games, what did I say that number was, Ryan? The last 2 games, like 287 against 260.5. In the last 2 games. Now, again, not great rush defenses, but you went way above and beyond what those teams are giving up. And that's kind of, that's kind of the point. I mean, yeah, those teams are not good on stopping the run, but, you had a level of success that really not many other people have had against them, right? And App State's the only team that's outrushed Notre Dame, and Notre Dame only got outrushed by App State because Notre Dame took 2 knees at the end of the game. So that they would have been above that as well and on par with yards per carry. They had the most yards, I believe, against BYU. Yes, 234 is 22 yards more than they've given up all year. It was also, here's the difference between BYU and North Carolina. This was the most yards per attempt that BYU had given up. Because one thing we pointed out last week is BYU was making team work for yards. That you weren't having teams ripping off like 6 yards a carry, 5.5 yards per carry. They had not allowed a single team all year, including Oregon, to go for over 4 yards a carry. The most they'd allowed at that point in time was 4.82. Now, Notre Dame was around the mid 4-point mark most of the game, but they kept at it, and then were able to break some late. That's the mark of a good offensive line.
Yep.
This team is geared towards stopping your run. We didn't like the play calling. And the other thing, too, is the play calling wasn't good for the run game, or the play design wasn't good for the run game. And they still were able to move BYU around. And that, to me, is the mark of a unit that's coming along. So, yes. But again, Ryan, this is the point. Don't take a step back in this matchup. And Zeke continuing to do what he's been doing and just getting steady. Josh Lugg is who he is. He's not going to all of a sudden turn into a dominant player. He is who he is. Just don't regress. I thought he was very good in pass pro last week. He did his job in the run game. That's all I ask him to do. Just do that. Blake Fisher, to me, and Zeke Correll, to me, are the 2 guys with the most potential to ascend moving forward. They're going to be the keys to this offensive line, Ryan. From your point, is they're about a top 10 unit right now based on the last couple of weeks. Would you agree with that? In the conversation?
Absolutely.
Those 2 guys continuing to ascend is what could vault Notre Dame from 10 to top 5-ish, which is where they're going to need to be to have success in November. Yes. Because the best defensive line that you're going to face, if not the best in all of college football, is still on your docket less than a month from now. So that's why a game like this is important. Ascend against Stanford and then BYU and then Syracuse as you get ready for Clemson. So, and then the backs continue to do what you've been doing. Continue to stay patient. Continue to just don't make the mistakes. No fumbles. No, bouncing a ball outside that should have just hit hard up. I mean, take the 3 if that's what's there, and know when to bounce. Know when to do those type of things. I think the one thing that's got to get better this week compared to last week is the perimeter run blocking was very inconsistent last week, especially in the slot.
Yeah.
That scenario's got to get better, and the tight end blocking has got to still get better as well. So that's going to be a key part of this.
Just throw him down with Harry Heastand, man. Let him get going, right? I mean,
they are playing 2 freshmen now, right? And there are going to be some lumps. I mean, like part of the reason the tight end blocking wasn't as good last week is because Eli Raridan had a rough game blocking. Well, that had been his strength. Freshmen are going to have inconsistencies. I mean, it's just part of life. I've never seen a freshman that didn't have a game where it's like, okay, he was doing well, but then he kind of took a step back. So you're going to have that. You're going to have some of those moments. That's the one position where a little inconsistency I'm going to be able to live with, just because your number 2 and your number 3 are true freshmen, and you own it. So I do expect that to get better. I don't think Eli Raridan is going to regress. Move. I mean, I think he's going to ascend and just a little step back, ascend, little step back. So I expect that to be a little bit better. And like Michael Mayer, it's just that he is who he is. I just don't see him getting better as a blocker. I think it's just who he is. I just want to be a little bit more consistent of what he does. Just get in their way a little bit more effectively, moving forward.